Hello, my name is Robbie Raphael Day. Welcome to the Deep Accessibility Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about SSI, or Supplemental Security Income. I have 3 journal articles that I'm actually going to talk about, and this is going to be a little bit of a different podcast than the previous 2 because we're going to be looking at the research process. So open right now, I have the large language model Claude 2 by Anthropic. And Claude is special in that it can actually take in, you may have heard of ChatGPT, but Claude is special because it can take in a significant amount more data. It can take in about 75,000 words, which is about 400 pages or so of text data, which is quite incredible. So I've asked it, I've literally just pasted in this document right here. And we'll read the abstract and actually get to see what Claude is telling us about what this paper is about. So this is from the Journal of Public Economics, and the title of the paper is Federalizing Benefits, the Introduction of Supplemental Security Income, and the Size of the Safety Net. So our abstract for this document, let me zoom on out a little bit. Of course, my head is going to be obfuscating your view a little bit. I did not mean to click that link. All right, view PDF once more, round 2. Okay, so again, once again, let's zoom in. In 1974, the abstract reads, Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, federalized cash welfare programs for the elderly, blind, and individuals with disabilities, imposing a national minimum benefit and differentially raising payment levels in states that paid below its benefit floor. We show that this increased disability participation but shrank non-disability cash transfer programs. For every 4 new SSI recipients, 3 came from other welfare programs. Each dollar of per capita SSI income increased total per capita transfer income by just over 50 cents. Federalizing part of a patchwork safety net need not increase redistribution by as much as traditional models of fiscal federalism suggest. Now, what's interesting is when I run this through Claude, I get a similar response. So you might as well just look at the abstract for this. I'm not going to go into the response too much because it's essentially the same as the abstract. One thing I do find interesting is these things like these ideas of caseload shifting. So who's responsible for the program? Now, something that I find really interesting for SSI, specifically for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, is that they fall within disability more general, which I'm wondering if physical disability was what was being being built around. I find the great irony of SSI and other government programs is their convolution and the challenge it is to actually understand what exactly we're talking about, right? And that's why I feel like I need so much research. But the idea of accessibility, information accessibility, is largely lacking, right? And adding, taking benefits from more state programs to federal programs could be better, but it also can be a lot of challenge as well as you interact with 2 state bodies or governmental bodies and actually try to understand how to receive benefits. And I'm not really saying here that people with physical disabilities would necessarily be able to understand this thoroughly either, because it's just very complicated. Like, it takes a lot of research, right? And it requires sort of an investment to actually understand what's going on. So it is very peculiar that way. So if I look at the second article I'm going to look at is from this paper right here. So it's from the National Bureau of Economic Research. I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and the paper is called Supplemental Security Income Program by Dugan, Kearney, and Renee. Let's look at the introduction right quick. So it talks about SSI, federally administered means tested program. In other words, you receive benefits based off of what income you get. And income's a big deal in this space. And another thing that's interesting is you have to not be receiving SGA, or substantial gainful activity. I don't know if receiving is the right word, but you cannot be engaged in SGA. In other words, you cannot be making over a certain amount of income. Otherwise, you will not be qualified for these government benefits. All right, so I asked Claude to go through this article as well and explain to me the differences between the two. It says this PDF provides additional details and context on the history, structure, and effects of supplemental security income. It says it gives more background on the origins, how it replaced state programs, and its goals of providing uniform and equitable benefits. It discusses more depth on discusses in more depth the disability determination process for adults and children and how it has changed over time. This is useful context for understanding enrollment trends. Now that's an interesting thing. How has it changed over time? This is really what I'm trying to get at, understand the history. Detailed statistics on characteristics of SSI recipients and how it's shifted over time. It reviews evidence of the effects of SSI on outcomes like poverty, income, parental labor supply. So the impacts of the program. It discusses issues around categorical eligibility requirements, work disincentives. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Long-term cost benefits and program interactions that relate to our discussion of caseload shifting incentives. It reviews. So I'm going to actually stick with a couple of these things. So I'm going to say, yeah, tell me about work disincentives. I've to spell this right. Disincentives, and quote explicitly from the source material. Okay, I ask it to quote from the source material specifically because I need to know, I'm still kicking the tires of Claude. I need to make sure it's working correct. But another point too is the idea of economic disincentives is sort of the most head-spinning thing. And I'm employed doing vocational training. So my whole role for this community is to help them find jobs and keep jobs. So I just find this kind of an interesting aspect. And the reality is most folks in this community are receiving SSI, but also when they are working, they need to have part-time jobs so that they don't trigger that substantial gainful activity challenge. Okay, so it's going to give me some direct quotes here, which is wonderful. All right, the paper discusses work disincentives for SSI in multiple sections. Here are some key points. Okay. Non-elderly adults who participate in SSI have very low labor force attachment. 4% having non-zero incomes in 2013. 4% having non-zero earnings 10 years ago. The issue of work disincentives is perhaps not as pertinent as it is for other means-tested transfer programs. And that's fine. I'm not necessarily saying it's a problem that folks aren't working. It's just the problem, it's just confusing because there's a lot of pressure, at least from the state, and I'll talk about the Lanterman Act later, but there's more pressure from the state to actually, which is a California state program, to get employment, right? So why is there this, it's kind of cutting both ways, right? SSI recipients' income would need to exceed $1,500 per month to fully phase out the SSI benefit. And then, of course, it gets complicated. Even after earnings exceeded the SGA, so substantial gainful activity, in practice, this is relatively rare. Okay, that's an interesting point right there. Actually, I'm curious if that's on page 12. So it says, in practice, this is relatively rare. In practice, and then is this actually page 12? Page 3. Did it get it right? Oh wait, there's a few of them. Practice. This is relatively rare. Did it get page 12 right? Let's go. That's pretty cool. Good for Claude. Takes an 80 pages and it figures out exactly where to go. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you'd be crazy not to get the benefits, right? Okay, and then it talks about families with children on SSI. And again, this idea of adults being on SSI is sort of the main point with this. All right, in summary, the paper discusses how SSI can disencourage work and earnings income due to benefit phase-outs, especially for families with children receiving benefits. However, it notes that adult recipients already have very low labor force participation, so the work disincentive effects may be smaller than in other programs. More research is needed, of course. There's always more research that's needed when you write research articles. I have never once not seen that put on there. All right, so let's take a look at our final article here, and then I'll call it with this this pod right here. So, Social Security, a Program and Policy History by Martin and Weaver. So Patricia Martin and David Weaver are with the Office of Retirement Policy, Office of Policy Social Security Administration. Okay. All right. Help me understand how the following article expands our discussion of SSI. Okay, take a minute for us to process this next one. So it went to about 80 pages to about, how many am I running through right now? I'm running in about 100 pages of text through the model right now. And it's, that big old Plinko machine is gonna give me its result here in a minute. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Okay, so this article gives historical context. I looked into Google Scholar for history of supplemental security income. So glad I'm getting more history here. SSI's origins back to the original Social Security Act of 1935. Okay, yeah, that's actually really what I want. So why was SSI created? How was it controversial? What happened in the 70s? So it talks about 1974, how it expanded. I think it might say in the response here, but it says, yeah, it expanded in the 1970s to provide a uniform benefit compared to patchwork of states programs. Interesting. And something I wonder about too is how does the government look at this kind of stuff? Like, does the government want to provide benefits, or does the government feel some sort of moralistic burden? Because I've seen both. Like, I've seen with Medicaid, I've seen things where you have to like repay them for services, but I've also seen situations in which governments seem to desire more like ownership over programs. Like the federal government's expanding its reach, and I wonder is funding these programs something that governments fight over, or is it something that they play hot potato with? And I think that would have say a lot about this community and how they're supported, right? Okay, so it's expanded so it says SSI was created in 1974. Okay, so that's when it was created. Federalize and standardize assistance for the elderly, blind, and disabled. National minimum floor for these groups, so those specific groups. Reduce this, so it's kind of like a universal basic income for those specific groups. Reduce the stigma, but it's not really though, because it's not. I wonder, so if we had universal basic income, would that act in the same way of like work disincentives that SSI does? That's an interesting question. SSI was controversial in a few ways. Expanding welfare versus focusing it only on families with children. Moving assistance for the elderly, blind, and disabled to a federal program imposed by costs in the states. Some saw it as more limited alternative to universal basic income, which had some support at the time. Interesting. Wow. SSI enrollment increased steadily. Okay, so I'm going to ask about, can you tell me about the support for UBI in the 1970s? And then in the 70s, there was like crazy inflation happening. That's kind of interesting. There's inflation happening now, and there's also discussion of UBI as well. So maybe that's just something that comes up when inflation happens. And that might also have something that might be interesting to watch if there's federal programs that are kind of like SSI that might pop up during an inflationary period like right now. There's another question I had too. Federalized, standardized assistance for elderly disabled. Oh, okay. Why did the federal government take on this role? Did they want to, or did the states want them to? So I know in the 1980s, there's a famous case of Reagan actually making the drinking age across the entire U.S. 21 because of like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving wanted that, and they wanted, and the federal government withheld spending on from the Department of Transportation if states did not change their drinking age, because states are the ones who have the enforcement and the law and the power to do this, authority to do this. So I find that pretty interesting that this sort of federal and state the dance that they do, and it's interesting because I interact more with state government programs myself in my day-to-day. The long shadow of the federal government is felt by all. Okay. So UBI from the 60s to 70s across the political spectrum really was interesting. Wow, there's a lot of people from Republicans and Democrats. On the left, UBI as a way to eradicate poverty. On the right, UBI was seen by some as an efficient way to streamline the welfare system. For example, Milton Friedman proposed a form of guaranteed income through a negative income tax. Interesting. Centrists saw UBI as a compromise between maintaining welfare programs and direct income redistribution. Wow. Huh. Okay, so federal government took on a greater role for a few reasons in the 1970s for SSI. States pushed for federalization to shift costs. Okay, that's what I was asking for. Many state governments dated back decades, and states wanted to offload costs to the federal government. And again, it's inflationary period, so I can understand why they would be facing issues. And the federal government can always print more money, so they could probably handle it. After expansions in the 50s and 60s, some saw Social Security as the natural system to bring these groups under. Policymakers saw federalization as a way to improve uniformity and perceived inadequacies in state-run programs. The Nixon admin saw it as a more targeted alternative to universal income support, like the Family Assistance Program. Very interesting. All right. So this is my workflow. Pretty simple. Thanks for learning a little bit about SSI with me.